for joining us on News Channel 5. Our top story tonight is our interview with Dr. David Blight. Dr. David Blight is a renowned author, professor at University of Yale, scholar, and winner of the Pulitzer Prize. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm having a little hard time hearing you, but I heard that mostly.
Could you please tell our viewers about Frederick Douglass?
Well, in brief terms, sure. Well, as you know, he wrote the most famous of all of the slave narratives, that is, an autobiography by a former slave. The one you read was published in 1845, but he was born a slave out on the eastern shore of Maryland along the Tuckahoe River in 1818. He lived 20 years as a slave. About 11 of those years out on the eastern shore in a rural agricultural form of labor. And he lived 9 of those 20 years in Baltimore, which had everything to do with why we know about him. By being an enslaved person in a city, especially a maritime city, a big ocean port, he had access to the world, or he had a vision out on the world, and then eventually access to escape. But after he escaped at age 20, he went on to become the greatest orator of the American abolition movement, the most important author of slave narratives, 2 great ones, the one in 1845 and a second one called My Bondage and My Freedom in 1855. He became an extraordinary political abolitionist by the 1850s and the major African-American voice about emancipation and the transformation of the United States during the Civil War. But the trajectory of his life is remarkable. He lived all the way to 1895 to the age of 77. And so his life encompasses this huge American story of slavery, the coming of the Civil War, the fighting of the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, the transformation of the United States and the 3 great amendments to the Constitution, and then that trajectory of the decline and defeat of Reconstruction all the way through the 1870s, 1880s, and into the 1890s. Above all, Frederick Douglass is in our attention, in our consciousness. He lives on, especially in the legacy of his words. He wrote millions of words. He spoke millions of words. He was a master of using the English language to penetrate the American consciousness in the 19th century, especially about slavery and racism. So in a quick package, that's why we're here talking about him, I think.
What inspired you to write this book about Frederick Douglass? What was your favorite experience while writing the book?
Well, I had many inspirations. I did my first book on Douglass way back in graduate school in the 1980s. It was a much shorter, narrower sort of book. He captured me even actually when I was a high school teacher. I spent the first 7 years of my career, Andrew, I don't know if you knew this, teaching in a large urban high school in Flint, Michigan, which is where I grew up. And that's when I first encountered Douglass and first taught about him. But then over time, I edited editions of his first 2 autobiographies. I wrote essays on him and so on. But what really inspired this book is the great good luck I had in encountering a private collection of manuscripts owned by a man named Walter Evans, who lives in Savannah, Georgia. It's a long story how that happened, but my encounter with him and his collection at his house in Savannah of an extraordinary collection of Douglass documents and material, especially family scrapbooks, is what induced me to consider a whole new biography of Douglass. I first encountered that collection almost 15 years ago, and I spent many, many, many weeks doing research on the dining room table of Linda and Walter Evans in Savannah, Georgia, using the collection in his house. That collection is now right here at Yale at the Beinecke Library. It took some years to do, but we finally negotiated a purchase by the Yale Libraries of that extraordinary collection. And it's all digitized, folks. You can go right to the Beinecke website and pull up all those scrapbooks, all that material, all those letters that I used in writing the book. That's what really inspired writing this particular book. I had no plan of a full life of Douglas. That was frankly too daunting until I bumped into that collection. Then it just felt like I had to try. Experience writing this book. Well, there are many. Some of it is my travel to places where Douglas lived, including in England and Ireland and Scotland. And then out on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. I have many favorite experiences visiting the sites of Douglas's youth and the Eastern Shore of Maryland. In biography, especially when you're trying to reconstruct a person's life, going to places where they live, places that shaped them in whatever situation those places are today, can be extraordinarily meaningful. I had many experiences like that. But I suppose my favorite experience simply is all those weeks I spent in Savannah doing research on a dining room table in this beautiful little brownstone house. I mean, it was like having a private archive, and it's a very special experience to do that kind of research. So I guess I'd rank that number one. But you know what? One other thing. I've had hundreds, if not thousands, of responses by readers, invitations to speak like this from your teacher, Mr. Doan. And often those are my favorite experiences. When a reader has read the book somewhere and writes to me and says, I've read every page of the book, I got captured in it, and so on and so forth. That's sometimes, always at somebody I don't know, that is sometimes my favorite moments. That's when you realize that as a writer, you actually have a reader. It'd be like being a singer. And I don't know, you go out on the corner and start singing, but there's nobody hearing you. But man, then a crowd gathers around and they start hearing you and they start clapping and they want to hear another song. That's what it feels like as a writer when people write to you and say, I was really moved by your book. I learned from your book. Can you also tell me this and this and this and this? I'd rank that up there too. Sorry, I had many different special experiences.
What made you interested in history?
Interested in history? Well, there are many sources of that. I had no particular stimulation to study history from within my family. I love my parents, they were amazing, but they were working class folk who never went to college. But I had two great high school history teachers. I'm not making this up just because you're in a classroom there with Mr. Doan. I had a great teacher, his name was Jack Howe, who taught Western civilization at Flint Central High School. He was a gruff old guy who never smiled, but my God, did he stimulate an interest in a sense of the past. And then I had a woman named Mildred Hodges who taught American history. In retrospect, I don't particularly like her method she used, but she was stern and she really taught us about causation. She was just obsessed with what caused everything. And I didn't know what that was about then, but I get it now. And then along the way, I can't fully explain, to be honest, how I came by this obsession with history. I wanted to be a history teacher. First, I just wanted to be a high school teacher at first. That is all I ever wanted to do. When I was in college and got out of college. But that came also from time and place. I was in high school in the mid 60s and in college in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It was an incredibly volatile time in America because of the civil rights movement and because of the Vietnam War, because of the politics roiling around our society as they are now. And I just became hopelessly fascinated with understanding, honestly, how do we get here? Why are people talking about a second Reconstruction? So what was the first one about? And then when I got the chance right out of college to be a high school history teacher, it it simply became my life, the center of my life. I could name you certain books. I could name you certain historians and writers who had a tremendous influence on me very, very early, but I'll spare you all of that. My interest in history came from the times I grew up in, a couple of teachers, and many different people I read. Last point about that, I didn't understand it when I was really young, perhaps your age. I began to understand it particularly while I was teaching, but I realized I was drawn to story. History is about the story, ultimately. And I am still just helplessly drawn to great narrative, great story. History is about the stories we tell. Some of those stories can kind of just entertain us, but some of them are deeply important to our purpose, our meaning as a country, our meaning as people, our very identities are rooted in the stories we tell each other. That's what history is. It's endless.
Which time period in world history would you have liked to live?
Well, it's got to be somewhere in the 19th century. That's where I've spent most of my mental consciousness for 40 years or more. On the other hand, I wouldn't have wanted to live in the 19th century's hygiene or its physical infrastructure, although we have a lot of problems with that today. Uh, if you visited a city, a major city in the United States in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, still most transportation was by horse, and that meant the streets were pretty messy. The idea that you could live in some idyllic situation back in history, you got to think about how did people actually live. But if I had to choose some kind of place to be, some kind of moment, it's probably somewhere there around the Civil War. I'm not sure exactly which moment because it was a terrifying time. Terrifying. People didn't know the outcome, of course, of major events any more then than we do now. But I might place myself somewhere in 1865 and 66 when the United States had to remake itself out of that colossal tragedy of the Civil War, to have breathed in the politics of that, to have breathed in the meaning of that historical moment as a participant, I suppose would be the place I would choose. I don't know, and maybe I'd just be out on a hike with Douglas on the Eastern Shore in the early 1880s when he went back to visit, and then I could interview him, which he never allowed me to do.
There has been a lot of controversy about the removal of statues all around the United States. At the beginning of the year, we learned about the potential removal of Christopher Columbus' statue downtown Syracuse, New York. Because of this accusation of genocides, natives in the West Indies, can you please tell us how you feel about statues being removed all around the United States?
I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think it's first important to note that our current ongoing debates about particularly Confederate statues and memorials of all sorts began in the wake of the massacre in Charleston in 2015. It's very important to understand the context of these things. That horrific mass murder by that young man, Dylan Roof, in the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, June 2000. In fact, that anniversary is coming up next week. Is what first stimulated this vast debate and confrontation over the meaning of Confederate flags, Confederate monuments. Now, we've had those debates many times before, but never quite like this. I have come to, I mean, I've been on many panels, and I've written fairly extensively in public press about this. I've come to believe that most publicly located Confederate monuments do need to be replaced, removed, possibly preserved in some ways, but removed from the most public spaces of American towns and cities and parks and so on. I am not for removing monuments, frankly, of any kind, in cemeteries. Cemeteries are burial sites. Memorials in cemeteries were put there to grieve the dead. And in the case of the American Civil War, that was an unprecedented scale of the dead. I'm also not for removing monuments on Civil War battlefield sites. There's been a lot of controversy and a lot of discussion of that as well. Those, most anyway, of those memorials, and the thousands of those, are placed there or were placed there over time to commemorate soldiers, individual units of soldiers, and so on and so on. Now, we don't have to love all those monuments. We don't have to agree with the cause, certainly, of so many of the people who are represented in those monuments. But in some ways, the battlefields are not unlike cemeteries. So I do make those kinds of distinctions. But in the main square of New Orleans, or on Monument Avenue in Richmond, and many other places, the public demonstration of a city, a town, a state's, a nation's identity in the public space is where we need to debate what monuments are to be there, stay there, or be replaced. I, for example, strongly believe that all Confederate monuments inside the United States Capitol, there are about 12 of them, including Jefferson Davis himself, the president of the Confederacy, who's in Statuary Hall, should be removed. Those people fought, led a crusade to destroy the United States government. And there are their monuments inside the US Capitol. The long reasons why they're there. I think we had a lesson that put that into vivid, painful relief back on January 6th, when that insurrection or assault on the US Capitol occurred, because Confederate flags were among the Trump flags, Gadsden flags, and US flags used by those rioters. That's the citadel of American democracy. That's what the Civil War, at least in an edifice, was fought to save. The ex-Confederates don't belong inside that building. They're still there, most of them. We could go on on this statues question all day. I'd love to, but I'm sure you probably have one or two more questions.
On a lighter note, what is your biggest pet peeve about your college students?
Did you say a pet peeve with college students? Oh, I love my students. I don't think I'm going to take the bait there. I guess I would say, sometimes, at least at a place like Yale University, not most of them, but some of them are a bit too entitled. They're waiting for the world to be presented to them because they believe they deserve it. Now, people do deserve things, I guess, although in my own background, I was kind of taught to never believe you deserve anything. That comes from growing up in a Lutheran church, so that's a long story. But I suppose that bothers me at times, but it's not that many. I mean, there's some fantastic students that I get to teach here at Yale, undergraduates and graduate students, and I'm inspired by them, frankly. I had lunch yesterday with two of my graduate students, one of whom had just taught my lecture course because I was on leave this semester from teaching. And he actually finished his PhD a year ago, but we hired him to teach my lecture class, and he had a great experience doing it. He was just inspired by most of these Yale students he got to teach, and we had this wonderful conversation about the joy of teaching, especially when students are responsive. I find I'm very lucky to teach at a place like this, but I've taught at all different levels. Believe me, I've, high school level. I've taught at a small college in Illinois. I've taught at another small college in Massachusetts, and now I get to teach at a fancy place like Yale. It 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 makes teaching one of the great pleasures in life when you have responsive students. But I do believe this, and Mr. Doan may or may not agree with me, but I think my job as a teacher is less necessarily to teach the actual details of my course, although that's important. My primary responsibility is just helping young people like you develop a sense of history, a sense of the past, the reason we need to look back, the reason we need to know where we came from. If my students can walk out just fascinated with things past, knowing that nothing in their present is comprehensible without knowing its past, I've done my job.
Thank you so much for allowing us to interview you today. It was a pleasure to have you on, and we hope you have a great day.
Well, thank you. I hope you have a great day too. Stay cool out there. It's going to be 90 again, I'm told. I'm heading over to the Beinecke Library to get into some good air conditioning.
Now on to Ross Post for the weather.
Thank you. Today will be sunny with a high of 71 and a low of 48. Tomorrow will be rainy with a high of 77 and a low of 61. Saturday will have thunderstorms with a high of 78 and a low of 55. Sunday will be rainy with a high of 80 and a low of 62. Monday will have thunderstorms with a high of 87. Back to Devin and Caden.
News reporters Lauren Gallagher and Race Brockway have been reporting on the abolitionist movement in our local area.
Today we continue our series with Lauren Gallagher and Reese Brockway in Rochester, NY, giving us more detail about Frederick Douglass's life.
Beginning of Frederick Douglass's life, he has had it rough like many others. He was born in Tuckahoe, Maryland, and within his slave life he went from plantation to plantation. But later, when he was left from slavery, he moved to Rochester, New York. Douglass's family was pretty remote. He didn't know who his father was, but he thought it was his first master. And he was not close with his mom, but his mother's name was Harriet Bailey. His first master had pleasure whipping his slaves like many others. Once Douglass saw his own aunt get whipped multiple times at a time. A few years later in his life, he went to live with the Auld family in Baltimore. They were one of the nicer slave owners. His mistress, Mrs. Auld, taught him to read the ABCs. But then his other master found out and flipped out. And that little part of his life made up his mind that he was now determined to escape from slavery. At his next home, the Hughes, he learned how to read and write. He had the plan to read better by becoming friends with the little white boys and giving them bread to teach them how to read. His fear of being a slave for life kept going on to him and made him more terrified each time. And with this thought, he resolved to run away. A few years later, he went to live with Mr. Covey because he was able to break slaves in when they didn't listen. His job was to take oxen and get lumber with them. One day he was sick and his master left him alone in the cold, and that made his plan to escape. He went to boats and found out their names of them and how to escape, and that's how he escaped slavery.
First, Frederick Douglass tried so many times to escape slavery. He finally escaped, and he got out with the heroin train trip all the way to Philadelphia from Baltimore, Maryland. So what it meant was he was free. He moved to Rochester, New York, and he moved here and published a new newspaper. They called it North Star newspaper. It was about that slavery should be end, and that the newspaper turned into the most influential black anti-slavery paper. After that, he was brought to Washington, D.C. in September 1870, and he became editor-in-chief and part owner of a national era. And after that, he died by a heart attack on his way back from a meeting about women's rights in Washington, D.C. So this is Frederick Douglass. He is in Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York.
Well, that's all for tonight on Channel 5 News.
As always, we are committed to exceptional news. Have a good night.